Sputnik that was launched in 1957. The Russians launched Sputnik into space in 1957. The very first satellite that ever went into orbit around the Earth. And that kind of built a fire under the U.S. government. We said, oh gee, if the Russians can go into space, we're going to have to do it too. So we very quickly formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, gave them a lot of money so they could build launch facilities and astronaut facilities and training and mission controls and all that kind of stuff. And that's how NASA got started, and that's the way we went. Now, the space program itself was kind of a stair-step program. We did the Mercury program. That was one man in a little tin can. I have to tell you, well, I'll tell you this in a minute. And it was just one guy in the spacecraft. The very first one just went up and right straight back down. That was Al Shepard 50 years ago, as a matter of fact. And then John Glenn went into orbit, went 3 orbits, and then Gordon Cooper, who was the last one, stayed up for 7 days in the Mercury. It was a very, very tiny little capsule, just for one person. Then we did the Gemini program. The Gemini program was designed to design and perfect all of the maneuvers and the things we'd have to do if we're actually going to make a landing on the moon. So the Gemini program came along. That was a 2-man program. I have to tell you, as you probably know, the first live species that we put into space were the monkeys. Okay? We had Ham and Enos, and we launched them into space on a Mercury capsule before we sent people up there. The Gemini program came along, and we needed something in between the Mercury and the Gemini. So, since it was 2 people, we put an astronaut in the left seat and a monkey in the right seat. Okay? They go into space, and they're in space for a while, and the astronaut calls down to Mission Control and says, what do we need to do? And Mission Control said, well, we got some things for you to do. And they read off a list of things to do, and when the astronaut said, okay, I'm getting ready to do them, they said, no, let the monkey do them. The monkey's all trained to do that. So he let the monkey do it. They went along for a while, and Mission Control called up and said, we got some more things for you to do, and the astronaut says, okay, what do we need to do? And he wrote down a long checklist, all the things to do, and he said, I'm ready to do them. And they said, no, let the monkey do it. He's trained to do that. So they go along for a little while longer, and finally the astronaut, very, very frustrated, says, okay, I'm ready for the next update, but it's really time. I want to do something. And Mission Control said, yes, we got something for you to do. And he said, what's that? He said, feed the monkey. The Gemini program was designed to test out the way of finding each other in space, the 2 spacecraft finding each other and then docking. And so those are 2 big things. Rendezvous and docking were things that we needed to learn. And the third thing was how to do spacewalks, how to do an extravehicular activity, how to get in a suit, get outside the spacecraft, and move around out in space. Because those were things we needed if we're actually going to make a lunar landing, which we did. Well, let me talk about the crew first. The crew on Apollo 15, if you can see this picture. The crew on Apollo 15 is David Scott on the left. Of course, that's me in the middle. You can kind of tell because I'm getting a little shiny on top even back then. And Jim Irwin on the right. Dave was the commander, Jim Irwin was the lunar module pilot, and I was the command module pilot. The command module pilot was responsible for flying everybody to the moon, staying in orbit while the other 2 land on the surface, and then bringing everybody back home. The commander his primary job was to fly the lunar module down to the surface and then fly it back up into lunar orbit when they're done. And the lunar module pilot is pretty much along for the ride. He is what we would call a systems engineer. He didn't get to fly anything, but he watched all the gauges. I'm going to show you the gauges so you see how complicated it is. But he was there to kind of keep an eye on things and make sure that whoever was flying the machine, like a co-pilot in an airplane, make sure that the pilot is doing the right kinds of things. The suits we have on are full pressure suits. You have to have pressure on the body to stay alive, to be able to live. So we had full pressure suits, which were The same as being in a spacecraft. In fact, a pressure suit is kind of like a little spacecraft that you live in just yourself. These suits are made up of a whole bunch of different layers of material, 27 different layers. They're all sewn together by hand. They're all individually fitted to us so that we could move. Like, it's very difficult with a suit that's got pressure in it to move your elbow, to bend your elbow. Very difficult. So you have to have the suit fit exactly right so that the elbow in the suit is where your elbow is. Okay? Very difficult to make all that work out. And of course, these were the first suits that we used in space extensively, so they were pretty crude back then. The ones they have today are much easier and much easier to get into and out of, and they work a lot easier than the ones we had. You can see in the picture here that Dave Scott has red stripes on his arms and on his legs. That's so mission control can tell who's who when they're on the surface of the moon, because the lunar module pod doesn't have those stripes. So if they're talking to somebody on the lunar surface and they got the TV camera on them, then they know that that's Dave because he's got the red stripes and they can talk to him directly. The crew patch on the left is something that we could pick on our own. See if we're going to show a little movie here. It'll take us just a second. And waited for the launch countdown. Our launch countdown was perfect. We launched at 9:34 in the morning. The sky was clear. Everything was cool. We launched on a machine weighed over 7 million pounds. Largest and heaviest vehicle that's ever been launched into space anywhere in the world. And we still hold that record. Because we were so heavy, we lifted off very, very slow. It took us a long time to get clear of even the launch umbilical tower. We're going to see if we can get this video.
11, 10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start. Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All engines running. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 9:34 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The tower is clear.
And we have a roll program. Roger. You have good traffic on by then. Thanks, Toro. Roll complete. Roger. And we have a pitch program. Roger.
You're floating inside a spacecraft. Once you leave Earth, once you get into orbit, you float inside a spacecraft. Now, I don't know what you learn in schools about gravity, but we're always under the influence of gravity when you're in space. There's no such thing. I know lots and lots of people talk about this thing called zero gravity. Well, you can tell anybody you talk to that there's no such thing. There is no such thing as zero gravity. You might be going fast enough that you kind of get to a neutral point, but you're always under the influence of a gravity field somewhere. Mostly it's the Earth's gravity, but then when we got to the moon, it was the moon's gravity. That was what controlled what we did. However, if you're inside a can that's also under the influence of that same gravity, then you can float around in the can as if there were no gravity between you and the can, right? Between us and the command module, as an example, we can move around the inside and float. And that's because we're both under the influence of the same gravity field. We're in free fall. If you can imagine jumping off a cliff, you're falling in free fall. That's what we were doing on the flight. We're not just floating around out there. We're in free fall the whole time. Well, you can look at it as zero gravity because us, with respect to the spacecraft, we're floating around inside as if there's no gravity. That causes some problems. I remember the first night out, I had a terrible time getting to sleep. We had sleeping bags, and the sleeping bags came up to our neck. So we get a sleeping bag, zip it up to our neck, wait for sleep. The problem I had was that my head kind of had a mind of its own. And as I started going to sleep, my head started to wander. let me say this. When we go to bed at night, we slide into bed and we put our head on a pillow, right? What happens, what makes your head stay on the pillow? Gravity? Yeah. Gravity keeps your head on the pillow. You don't have to think about it, you don't have to worry about it. You relax against the gravity and you go to sleep. When you're in space, you don't have gravity helping you, so your head is free floating. And as you go to sleep, it kind of floats around and it wakes you up. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you, just as you're going to sleep, have that feeling of falling off a cliff? Has anybody here ever had that feeling? Sure. I think we all have one time or another. Let me tell you, in space, that's exactly what you're doing, is falling off the cliff. And you have to do something about that to get to sleep. So what I did is I put my head in the sleeping bag and kind of stabilized my head, and then I could go to sleep. The second night was a lot better, and the third night was, I didn't